What are the ramifications for the American people in the latest peace negotiations in the Russia-Ukraine war? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy and has for many years. I'm joined by my longtime co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, great to be back with y'all. I want to just remind y'all that this is our end of year fundraising time. You guys have gotten us through 36 years here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And each year I'm just honored and grateful. We all are here at FFF. We couldn't do it without those of you that help us out in a bigger way and also a smaller way. We rely on all those donations. So if you could find it within your means to help us out, get through another year, this is the big time of year that helps us through the new year. We'd be very honored and appreciative.
Well, if I can just add a few words, I've worked with Jacob Hornberger since the beginning, when he founded the Future Freedom Foundation back in 1989, 1990. And I can say that there are very few organizations espousing the cause of liberty anywhere, not just in the United States, but the world, that represents a position and a perspective as logical, consistent, and uncompromising as the one that Jacob has held up as a banner for all of these long decades. The cause of freedom is under attack today. It's under attack both around the world and certainly in the United States. Opponents of individual freedom, critics and those who want to limit economic liberty, those who are less concerned with our civil liberties, upon which our fundamental freedoms are based: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of association. And the interventions, not only at home, but around the world, that drag America into the potential of war, conflict, the loss of lives, destruction, and the wealth and fortunes of the American people. Someone has to stand up and raise the issue of what is the role of government? Is it to be a master or to be a servant? Is it to be limited by the Constitution, or is it to be unlimited to wield its power in any way that the persons in authority choose to at our expense? That voice that offers that uncompromising vision is the Future of Freedom Foundation. So, as Jacob was saying, if in some small way, moderate way, or perhaps even generous way, you can help the foundation for another year, keep this message alive, it will be appreciated, I know, by Jacob and by myself and all those who care about the ideal of liberty here and around the world.
Thank you, Richard. That means a lot. Richard and I go back all the way to the 1980s when I was practicing law there in Dallas, Texas, and he was teaching economics there at the University of Dallas. And, we met. I hired Richard to tutor me in Ludwig von Mises's magnum opus, Human Action. We did a chapter by chapter analysis, and I could tell that we were on the same page in terms of raising people's vision to a higher level when it comes to liberty, to the idea of what genuine freedom is all about. And when I started FFF, Richard was by that time the the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at the Citadel. I was just leaving the Foundation for Economic Education fee to start FFF, and so Richard was serving as FFS Vice President of Academic Affairs, and we were talking about all the positions we were taking in that first year. And Richard sort of shook his head and said, with all these positions we're taking that are totally uncompromising, we will have alienated everybody by the end of the first year. We'll have gotten rid of everybody and we'll be down to two, and then I'll do my best to get rid of you. But what actually we lost donors because of this position or that position or that position. But what I learned was over the last 36 years that there have been those of you that saw the importance, even if you didn't agree on every position, you saw the importance of a foundation that presents this principled, uncompromising case for liberty. And that's why it's been such an honor to receive y'all's support that has kept us going with this kind of message. This is the message that influenced the course of my life, that changed the course of my life. When I was in Laredo, Texas, my hometown, practicing law in my late 20s, I discovered these four little books that presented this principled case for liberty, and that message, that principled message, uncompromising message, really served as the inspiration, because I figured if it worked on me and it got me to change the course of my life, it can also work on changing the course of other people's lives. And so that's what we've done for 36 years, and we greatly appreciate your continued support. So, Richard, one of the big areas that we've addressed since 1990, when we were first publishing our monthly journal, is foreign policy, and of course the national security state, foreign interventionism, and it's of course still with us in a very dangerous fashion, especially there with Ukraine and Russia's war against Ukraine, and it's always in the news, but it's become more prominent lately because of the peace negotiations that President Trump is trying to get between Russia and Ukraine. They seem to shift back and forth. I think Trump would love to have a Nobel Peace Prize by initiating the process for peace there, even as he's has his armed forces killing people in the Caribbean and the Pacific near Venezuela, and is seizing ships and closing airspace and threatening an attack, a military attack for regime change purposes there in Venezuela. Um, but there's a lot of dimensions to this Ukraine-Russia war that we can explore in this segment of Libertarian Angle. But one of the ones that I'll start out with is this latest proposal where Trump seems amenable to having the United States provide security guarantees to Zelensky and to Ukraine, which to me, it flies in the face of the whole reason why Russia invaded in the first place, is that they Russia did not want Ukraine to be part of NATO. They didn't want any of the Warsaw Pact countries to be part of NATO. It's my conviction that NATO is an old World War II dinosaur, Cold War dinosaur. It should have gone out of existence at the end of the Cold War. And they promised they wouldn't expand eastward, but instead they kept moving eastward, absorbing Warsaw Pact countries, knowing year after year that Russia said, "We don't want your nuclear missiles near us." It was the same attitude as if Russia was putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. You know what the U.S. response would be, or if Russia started helping Venezuela in some kind of war against the United States by furnishing them armaments, or putting nuclear weapons nearby in some nearby country. We know what the U.S. response would be. And so I don't see how that significantly makes the situation better, that you're now going to have the United States or individual EU countries, which would be their business, but to pledge U.S. support in case another war breaks out. I don't see how that's going to satisfy Russia at all. I mean, that's what they're trying to obviate. But the whole notion of pledging the lives of the American people for the sake of a foreign country that usually has a regime that's totally corrupt, to me is phenomenal. Now they're talking about possibly turning it into a treaty, which would at least make it a little bit better under the Constitution, but not morally speaking. Why should the lives of the American people be pledged to support a regime thousands of miles away? And then there's also always the risk of nuclear war. I mean, it's just amazing to me that the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA are always willing to push that envelope, and risk all-out nuclear war, which is what they're doing, not only now, but also with this pledge that they're proposing of having the United States provide security guarantees to Zelensky and Ukraine. I think it's a very problematic, a very dangerous, and a very unwise course of action. What do you think?
Well, just I'll amplify a number of the themes that you were bringing out. First of all, this is all arisen, as Jacob was just saying, because when the Cold War ended with first the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, then the Russians, the Soviets, withdrawing forces and their support for communist governments in Eastern Europe, and then finally the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in the second half of 1991. Uh, the United States and its major Western allies had, in a sense, won, right? And that was they patting themselves on the shoulder. We won the Cold War. We won the Cold War. The Soviets lost. They're not even on the map of the world anymore. And whether it's informal or formal, whether the wording was one way or another, it was clear that first with Gorbachev and then when Yeltsin, as the first president of the post-Soviet Russia, were interacting with Western leaders, the United States, NATO, European NATO leaders, the general understanding was that the United States and NATO would not proceed to envelop the former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe. They would not be under Soviet control. Soviet soldiers or Russian soldiers would not be there. The idea of a sphere of influence that Russia set the tone wouldn't be the case, but they would be sort of a neutral buffer in a post-Soviet, post-Cold War era. They could integrate into EU, which they all did, but the issue was them approaching closer and closer to the border of the new post-Soviet Russia lines as part of a military alliance that could be viewed by the Russians in certain circumstances as threatening. But the United States and NATO proceeded to do that. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And then finally it came to the matter in 2014 with a coup d'etat in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, that clearly was meant to put in a Western-friendly government into power, which the Russians immediately viewed as a violation of all of the, at least tacit, between the lines understanding that it was bad enough that that NATO absorbed the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe, but now and the Baltic republics that had been part of the Soviet Union, but now Ukraine, which was like literally bordering on the heartland of European Russia. And whether you want to view it as justifiable or not, if I was a libertarian in Russia and I was making the cases that I, as a libertarian, would be presenting to Putin, I would say it's none of your business if Ukraine wants to join NATO. It's a separate, independent country. If you're going to be a free country in Russia, then Russia's only role is to be defensive. Are you being attacked? Are nuclear missiles flying? No. So, just bite the bullet and eat it. But the fact is that given the mentality that Putin has, he's authoritarian. He has this idea that the geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. His wish to make Russia great again on the international stage, politically, militarily, and so on. It was inevitable, as a matter of realpolitik, that once there was this attempt and success at a regime change in Kiev, and the fear that if Ukraine became part of NATO, that would include the naval bases that had traditionally been for Soviet and then Russian in the Crimea. So then Putin began his actions in response to this, his reaction to this. The little green man who suddenly appeared in Crimea, and suddenly there's a takeover of Crimea. And then Ukraine just hunkers down, want to belong to NATO, want EU. And so finally this led to and the conflicts in eastern Ukraine. The fact is that while you could say that ethnically Ukrainians and Russians are not very different, culturally and linguistically there are differences. And there's a heavy Russian language and cultural population in eastern Ukraine. And there were hardliners in Ukraine who wanted to suppress the Russian language, prevent it from being taught in schools. You had to learn Ukrainian, narrowing the number of television and radio shows that could be presented in the Russian language. It had to be Ukrainian. And the Russians chafed under this. Now, again, whether from a libertarian point of view or not, you could argue that Russia legitimately could then move into this area or support a revolution in this area. That's a different matter. The fact is, Putin did it. And what has been the reaction since then? Oh, Russia's the aggressor. We are innocent babes in the woods as part of NATO and the European Union. We've had nothing to do with creating a set of circumstances that the Russian bear might respond to. It's not our fault. It's not our fault. We have to help the Ukrainians because we're protecting freedom for the world. And as a consequence, they have now created a situation in which this war has gone on for 4 years. It did not turn out how Putin wanted. He thought he'd have a victory in weeks. Kiev would fall to his troops. But the fact is that 20% of the country in the east is under Russian control. It's been static. It's been hard for the Russians to move forward. They've created for their own soldiers a meat grinder of death and destruction. But Putin doesn't care. That's the problem with an authoritarian, particularly in the Russian cultural tradition of czars and commissars. They don't care. So they're willing to grind ahead little by little, a kilometer, a village, just eat it up. And this idea that the Ukrainians would have the ability, either in manpower or material, to withstand this in the long run, or to reverse it, to recapture the occupied territories, is a delusion. And it's a delusion fed first by Biden, and then certainly continuing to by the European Union leaders of Britain, France, Germany, that the idea is we just give them enough money and they'll keep fighting. Even though the Ukrainians have now resorted to a brutal conscription, the episodes that have now become immensely public of corruption of hundreds of millions of dollars and euros given by the United States and the European countries that have just disappeared. And that the idea that just feeding this on can keep this going is an illusion. But this is a self-righteous virtue signaling. Russia is bad. We have to support the good cause, and this war has to go on. But to what end? Unless the European Union members of NATO or the United States itself wants to literally risk putting boots on the ground and an out-and-out war with Putin's Russia, there is no way that Ukraine in the long run is going to win. So better, in an imperfect world in which right does not always perfectly win against wrong, just realpolitik here, the Ukrainians should cut the best deal they can because this will just go on endingly. Because Putin, as long as he has no opposition at home and he's crushed the opposition and he keeps various groups in Moscow and St. Petersburg happy to not feel that the war is going on for them, the meat grinder will just continue. And more Ukrainians will die. More and more of Ukraine will be bombed. And at the end of the day, the eastern part of Ukraine is going to be de facto accepted as Russian territory. And Ukraine will have to accept that it's not going to be in NATO. And it's just going to have to deal with a neighbor who is constantly looking over the fence at what they're doing and how they're doing it. Now, again, I want to emphasize, if I was a classic liberal or a libertarian in Russia, I would say the same thing that I would tell Donald Trump if he were to hear me. It's none of America's business. It's not even your business to try to negotiate a deal from which you hope to get economic leases and arrangements for your crony buddies. It's not your business. Okay? I would tell Putin, it's not your business what goes on in Ukraine. But in the real world, the best policy that America could follow, and the wiser policy that even the European countries should follow, is to realize that they poked the bear has responded, cut your losses, bygones are bygones, and try to save as much of Ukraine can by the Ukrainians themselves. Otherwise, this is the unending war, and we always can be sucked into it depending upon the politics, the circumstances, and the unintended consequences that can emerge.
Well, you make a lot of great points, and I agree with all of them. I'd like to emphasize also another dimension of this. It'll never happen, but I think it's important to emphasize is that another part of a major solution here, a long-term solution, is to just dismantle NATO, where it's no longer absorbing all these Eastern European countries. It's not a matter of whether Ukraine can join NATO or not, because NATO doesn't exist anymore. Then Russia doesn't have to worry about NATO, putting its U.S. missiles right there on its border or whatever. They could still make an alliance, obviously, with Ukraine or any other Eastern European country. But this whole notion, I mean, to me, Richard, the whole Cold War was a racket that it benefited the national security establishment. Tons of money were coming in because the Reds were supposedly coming to get us. And with the end of the Cold War, there was a great opportunity People were talking about the peace dividend and so forth. If they had dismantled NATO, who knows what would have happened in terms of a peaceful, harmonious, friendly relationship between Russia and the Western world and so forth. At least things were moving in that direction. The fall of the Berlin Wall, those were times where people were exultant over what was happening. And instead, what the Pentagon and the CIA ended up doing is using NATO to really get us back to Cold War II. I mean, look at the hostile relations now between Russia and the United States, also China with the trade war business. The whole Cold War mindset is back with Cold War II. And so I would say that that's an important part of this whole thing. Just dismantle this Cold War dinosaur. I find it amazing, absolutely amazing, that they have figured out a way, the national security establishment, the president, to provide security guarantees for all these Warsaw Pact countries without having to go to Congress. I mean, you would think that before the life of an American is pledged, American citizen, through conscription, especially the draft, but through any war, that they can just pledge our lives, the lives of the American people, in defense of Moldavia, or whoever, some other country there, without going to Congress. I find amazing, and yet that's what they do with NATO. To me, it's the Pentagon and the CIA, the National Security Establishment, the president that have made these decisions that we're going to pledge the lives of the American people in defense of Romania or whoever. We don't have to go to Congress. That to me shows you the horrible part of this whole NATO agreement from the beginning.
Well, I 100% agree with you. In the post-Soviet era, if NATO was viewed as a defensive alliance against what was viewed as a fear of a Europe threatened by Stalin and the Soviet Union, well, that threat is gone. That it dissipated when Gorbachev basically let the Berlin Wall fall in November of 1989, withdrew forces from the Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe, and then certainly with the demise of the Soviet Union uh, at the end of 1991. At that point, what is the purpose of a defensive alliance if the political power that you're supposedly defending against literally does not exist anymore on the map of the world? And it should be kept in mind that at first, during the first 10 years after the end of the Soviet Union, you basically had this government with Boris Yeltsin as the president of the Russian Federation. And he was very amenable, and many Russians were too, to joining peaceful commercial and cultural and economic relationships with the West. Most Soviet citizens had a dream of being like members of a normal society, which by what they meant us, civil liberties, their notion of free enterprise, governments that didn't come looking for them in the middle of the night and take them off to some labor camp. That's what the average Russian wanted. But because of the response of the NATO countries over that decade of the 1990s, and then following that, when Putin became president in 1999, under its own circumstances, with Yeltsin resigning, the fact is that the die was cast. The circumstances were created that was going to bring about these unintended consequences of now this major war in Europe. And it is not, the criticism of American intervention and European financial and military feeding of Ukraine's attempt to withstand this much larger power, I have to highlight, in my view, is not Kremlin talking points, not eating Russian propaganda. It's not a rationale, justification, or an excuse for Russian military aggression. The Russians should not have invaded Ukraine. From a classic liberal libertarian point of view, the internal affairs of another country, even if it's bordering on you, as long as they're not attacking you, is none of your business. Okay? Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. Just because another country follows policies you don't like, that's life in a free society and a free world. But the fact is that Russia has chosen to follow this policy, And all it is going to do is going on forever, killing more Ukrainians, bring about more destruction to the lives, industry, and infrastructure of the Ukrainian society, and making the cost of rebuilding it at some point, regardless of the terms of the peace, far more costly, and with a lot fewer people left whole in mind and body. This is a terrible tragedy. Yes, it's the worst war in Europe since the Second World War in terms of magnitude, length of time, destruction of physical properties and loss of life. It is not, no doubt. But but all that the United States and especially the Europeans are doing is prolonging this in a way that's going to still have its inevitable end in one way or another, unless the European Union and the United States literally wants to risk war with Russia. At the end of the day, Russia is going to come out more of a winner than a loser. And the Ukrainians are just going to have to bite the bullet and try to make the best of an extremely continuing bad situation. That's just the reality. All the virtue signaling about money and supporting and we're holding back, Russia like Hitler should have been held back in 1938 at Munich doesn't change the fact that on the ground, it's just going to suck us into a terrible conflict, possibly, and will just make the Ukrainians have far more suffering than would necessarily have to be the case.
Yeah, see, I think your point about realpolitik is really valid. I mean, I agree with you. Russia had no legal or moral authority to invade, but as a matter of realpolitik, everybody knew that they were going to because they said they were going to. And yet, knowing that, the U.S. says we don't care. We're going to invite Ukraine to join NATO. But wait a minute, you know they're going to invade because of this. Well, if they invade, they invade. And I'll never forget Brzezinski, a national security advisor after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in '79. He later gave an interview where he was exultant and said, "We provoked him into invading. We sucked him into invading." And I'm sitting there saying, "Why would he be bragging about that?" And his response was, "We wanted to give them their own Vietnam," which meant we want them to lose tens of thousands of soldiers, just like we lost tens of thousands of soldiers in Vietnam. Well, what kind of mindset is that? These are regular soldiers with families, brothers, sisters, spouses. And so I could easily see that same mindset operating. Okay, they invade Ukraine. We're prepared. We're prepared to supply all kinds of weaponry to Ukraine to help them. We'll give them their own Vietnam or their own Afghanistan because the United States has been bogged down in Afghanistan for 20 years prior to this crisis. The other thing, Richard, is that the right wing sometimes says, or the interventionists say, oh, well, Russia has nothing to worry about. America is a peace-loving nation, so they have their missiles on Russia's border. What's the big deal? They would never be aggressors. What? Martin Luther King described the U.S. government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Okay, that was 1967, but I don't think he was talking about just Vietnam. He was talking about this gigantic war machine that the U.S. government is under a national security state. Look at what's happening in Venezuela. 6 months ago, there was nothing going on with Venezuela except the sanctions and the refugee problem and the immigrant problem. There is now this giant military armada from this peace-loving nation that is getting ready, that is really already attacking Venezuela. They're killing their citizens on the high seas. They're seizing ships without any kind of legal authority under this notion of, oh, they violated our sanctions. And they've closed the airspace, essentially threatening to shoot down airplanes, civilian airplanes, and threatening to attack the entire country militarily under this guise of the war on drugs or the war on terrorism. This is the peace-loving nation that interventionists say there's nothing to worry about. Martin Luther King was right. This is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And I could easily understand why Russia or any other country would sit there and say, well, maybe we don't want their nuclear missiles on our border.
Well, you see, the difficulty of understanding this is that it is always easy to see the imperfections, the errors, the omissions, the mistakes, the cruelties, the injustices of another country. And therefore, a country of another people. But it is quite another thing to be able to see the same policies and the injustices and the cruelties and the aggressions and the violations of rights when it's your own country. Because somehow, how can my country do this, particularly since we're constantly indoctrinated? America is the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now, I do not want to anyway denigrate those who have fallen in the American armed forces, who innocently, sincerely believed that they were fighting for their country. People chose to give their lives with most of them with the best intentions that they felt that they were defending America in the broadest sense. But in fact, far too many of those individuals were placed in harm's way when they didn't need to be by those in Washington who had other ideological, political, and international agendas for which American soldiers were basically the cannon fodder, and therefore were brought to injury, death, for reasons having nothing to do with really preserving freedom at home, but to serve interventionist purposes by those in political power in Washington, D.C., regardless of the political party label they may operate under. And that is the biggest tragedy.
On that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Richard, as always, greatly enjoyed the conversation. And again, if you guys could give us a hand here end of year with a generous donation to FFF, we'd be very honored and appreciative. And thank you for the great support y'all have given us for 36 years. Richard, look forward to talking to you next time.
Until next time.